Shalom all. Ariel Tzadok here from the KosherTorah School. You find us online, of course. Where else? www.KosherTorah.com. Well, I'm about to share with you in our little class this evening an important topic which I have to confess I've kind of debated. I've struggled with whether I really actually want to reveal the secrets about what we're going to talk about tonight. You know, let me share with you a little bit of background understanding. The topic of what we're going to talk about tonight is the Kabbalistic Talmud. And I'm going to talk about the actual true essence and nature of the Babylonian Talmud. The Talmud, as most of you should know, is the foundation of what we today call Rabbinic Judaism. Let's put things into a little bit of a context, okay? A little history, if you will, of Judaism, if you will. According to our faith, now again, let's emphasize faith. Torah, as we know, was received by Moses at Mount Sinai, and according to Pirkei Avot, was passed on to Yehoshua. Yehoshua passed on through the prophets, etc., and so on, through the history as we have it outlined in the biblical books, until the time of the Babylonian exile, which was in the year 586 BCE. For the record, there is a later belief in certain Jewish circles that places the dating of the Babylonian exile about 160 years or so later. If you look at some of the more popular Orthodox works, they'll have that later date. That later date's inaccurate, and I might add, intentionally so. The sages, way back when, intentionally concealed many things, especially times, which is actually hinted to in the end of the book of Daniel. But the actual date of the Babylonian exiles, 586 BC and BCE, according to want to be politically correct in Jewish circles. And from then on, things changed. With the conclusion of prophecy, the final prophets in the biblical period, which is, of course, Malachi, Zechariah, Haggai, prophecy, and we've discussed this in other classes, came to an end. Now, that doesn't mean that communication with heaven ended. What it means is that the social message of an individual to the nation ceased. Pretty much any and all social messages that we needed to receive, we already got. Communication, connection, communion has never ceased to this very day. And those of us who practice the biblical or prophetic traditions, what we call the Kabbalah Nevu'it, the Aliyah school of Kabbalah, we practice these things to this very day. Now, understand that during the time of the Greek immersion in the Jewish tradition, well, it wasn't always so bad and negative as it was under the period that led to the Hanukkah Wars. Initially, the interaction between Grecian and Hebraic, I don't want to call it Jewish yet, Hebraic culture was originally getting along fine. Now, there was, we know historically, what they call the Hellenists, those people who were very much interested in giving up their Judaic context. We see that same, if you will, spirit, psychology or philosophy active in, if you will, the Jewish world throughout history, even to this very day, assimilationists, if you will. But there arose a group of, let's be blunt, practitioners of the old school who had their pulse on the way of things, could foresee the truths, read the times a la Daniel, and these became the leaders and the guides of the people. They became known as the teachers who would interpret the Torah in a practical day-to-day way for the people. They would give the perush of the Torah. That's the commentary, the interpretation thereof. And therefore they were called the perushim, or the Pharisees. Now, some people interpret the word parush meaning they were the separate ones. But here we're getting into a little blurry area. We're all very familiar with a group today called the Essenes. We associate them with the Dead Sea Scrolls and Qumran. Back about a century or so ago, there arose groups, I think more so in Europe than anywhere else, who identified the Essenes as being like a pre-Christian, like Judaic sect, which kind of led into Christianity, and therefore identified the Essenes as being this peace-loving sweetheart of a group of people, and everybody today wants to call themselves like modern-day Essenes and the like. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Essenes were a bunch of very violent, separatist, racist, in my opinion, were extremist bad apples. From what we know of this group and their philosophy, they were very violent, they were very racist, and, let's be very honest, the line between the Essenic philosophy and that which we call the Pharisaic Perushi philosophy, is a very blurry line to separate the two. In spite of what we can read in books like Josephus, who said that there was difference in philosophies and the like, well, if you really look and analyze Essenic practice and beliefs, you'll find a lot of those practices and beliefs right amongst the sages of the Talmud, whether it's with regards to the times of prayer, rising up in the morning. We have references to groups in the Talmud called the Eda Kadisha of Yerushalayim, or the Watikin. Well, if we look at the practices of these groups, we find very similar to the practices of these called the Essenes. The real difference, if you will, between the Perushi and the Essenes, whatever their real Hebrew name was, because Essene is not a real name of this group, was a difference in how they came to interpret the Torah. The Perushim, they came to interpret the Torah, if you will, in a way of peace. They sought a universalist way of understanding what we today call the way, if you will, the Torah Tao. We call it today halacha. The halacha is the way that we walk and talk, breathe and exist in the Torah path. The sages said something very profound, that since the time of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, the only place where God's presence is found is in what's called the Arba Amot, the 4 square, make a little square there, the 4 square feet of halacha. Now, obviously, that's a symbolic measure of any kind of space. What the intent is, that if one wishes to bond with or discover God, one finds God by walking the way with God. That's the secret therein. Now, this was called a perush, or the interpretational way. And it was in the hands of all the sages together. This is a major point. Rabbis have never ever claimed to be prophets. No rabbi has ever come forth to say, "Thus saith the Lord." Rabbinic Judaism is the continuation of prophecy. No, on the contrary, it's very different. Especially those of us trained as rabbis. We are emphatically taught that when it comes to understanding halacha, the way, to know the distinction and difference between the way of the Torah, which comes from Sinai, as our faith teaches us, which is called Deoraita, and the words of our sages, called Derabanan. Very, very important difference between the two. The Essenes had a very different way to them. They believed that their Rebbe, their teacher, what they call the Moreh Tzedek, the teacher of righteousness, not only was he a continuation of prophecy, he was the only one who had the ability to properly interpret the Torah for the time, circumstance of situations. His interpretation became known as a pesher. So this is a big difference between the pesher and what we call the pshat. The pesher was always a politically active, usually very violent interpretation of things. We can look at the examples of the Dead Sea Scrolls for examples of this. And pshat, basic understanding of the Torah. Now, this is very important. You might think you're yawning at me saying, oh, Rabbi, this is boring history. Who cares? Well, you should. Why? Because if we're here to talk about walking with God, that which we today call Kabbalah, the mystical bonding with God, which is the biblical commandment of devikut, bonding with God, then you have to understand how our sages taught us to practice this and what comes along with it. Unlike many of my peers who only study the system, if you will, from the outside, they will practice whatever forms of meditation they picked up from books, but they don't go anywhere with it. They get caught up in the realms which, according to Ezekiel or Eliyahu, biblical examples, we call the storm, the cloud, or the fire. They're never taught or trained how to go beyond. They don't know how to go beyond the books. They're limited. They're bound. They exist in the world, which later Kabbalists would call the Olam HaTohu, the world of chaos, confusion, in which they exist in a mindset of duality, fighting good and evil, and all kinds of mythologies based upon what the books say and their literal interpretations of these things. They have no personal experience, no insights, because they haven't been trained in the Aliyah school. They haven't been trained in the prophetic paths. They think they understand Pshat, but they don't understand even that. Certainly not Pesher. We don't do Pesher interpretations anymore. We don't ascribe authority to any Morei Tzadok in Judaism. There is no single authority. That was the wisdom and the important message of Rabbinic Judaism. Now understand that this is all by divine design. Judaism, Torah, evolves. It has to evolve because we as human beings are evolving. We use a more Kabbalistic term, and we use the word tikkun, or rectification. In the Lurianic system, the Kitvei Ha'ari, we talk about the nature of tikkun as a continual process until we can, using Arizal terms, rectify or elevate all the rafah nitzotzin until we can mitaken or rectify all the sparks of holiness, until then Mashiach will come. Now, this is all symbolic terminology, the nature of which is not necessarily important to our present discussion. But understand this. Our sages foresaw the evolutionary path. This is why they established the great schools in Babel, in Babylon, which existed literally to like the late 1940s. The Babylonian exile officially came to an end with the establishment of the State of Israel. Babel became the center of a universalist path of Torah, whose intent it was to plant the seeds of connection throughout all the ways and paths of the world. And indeed, it succeeded to do so. So understand, as the temple was destroyed, which was, as we say, by divine design, the nature and observance of biblical Judaism focused around the temple and sacrifices came to an end. And even though to this very day we, of course, pray for the reestablishment of the temple, the restoration of sacrifices, a point that's made very clear by Maimonides himself in the Guide to the Perplexed, all the practices of temple-based Judaism was there for a time, was there for a purpose, at a specific level of consciousness, which we've evolved beyond. You can go into the teachings of the Kabbalah, and they will tell you, even when the, in quote, third temple comes, and remember, the third temple is never supposed to be built by human beings. Even the Talmud states very clearly the third temple is supposed to come already built from heaven. Some of my Peers from the ancient alien shows might want to say, well, that's a mothership landing from outer space. Well, maybe it is. I guess we'll find out when the time comes. But it's not going to be a restoration or a return to that which was gone, which we've evolved beyond. You see, this is the nature of spirituality. Rabbinic Judaism is definitely, if you will, an evolution, continuation of biblical Judaism. It's not the same, by all means, no. And this is all summed up in a very, very important teaching that is recorded in the Talmud, a very famous example of an argument between two sets of rabbis. There's actually one rabbi versus the lot. It was Rabbi Eliezer versus Rabbi Yehoshua and the sages. They were arguing and debating over the nature of a specific type of an oven, whether or not this oven was considered or should be considered kosher. Well, if you looked at the technicalities of the oven, yeah, it would pass muster being kosher. And that was Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. But the sages said, there's more to it than this. When we want to walk the way, and we understand that the way of God is in how we practice and observe Torah in the pshat of things, we must take into account human consciousness, where the human mindset is at both the collective and individual level. And therefore, recognizing the level where consciousness was at that time, they recognized and could see into the future that the nature of this, in quote, kosher oven would be very confusing due to the details of the subject, which you don't have to get into right now. And therefore, they decided, we're going to just generalize and say, no, the oven's not kosher. Pretty much the story. Rabbi Eliezer says, you can't do that. You can't change the nature of the reality of a thing. To which the sage said, no, we have the obligation to. We must be in a dance with, in harmony with, in flow with the collective consciousness. Rabbi Eliezer, almost like in that Essenic adamant, said, no, no, no. The sage said, no, you got to be more fluid. You got to go with the flow. And Rabbi Eliezer says, if I am right, I call upon the powers of nature itself to verify and stand up for me. And all kinds of basic miracles allegedly happened. And finally, the sages, they said, we're not interested in all this miracle hocus pocus stuff. The Torah is not in heaven. The Torah is on the earth. The Torah is not subject to objective reality, but subjective reality. We have to live by that subjective reality and the reality in which we live. This is, as the Ariel would later call it, the tikkun of the rafach nitzotzin, the raising up of the sparks of holiness. And therefore, they ignored all the different evidences, if you will, that Rabbi Eliezer was bringing. Finally, in frustration, he called upon heaven itself to respond, to verify and validate him. That's a very pesher thing to do. And a voice was heard from heaven saying, why do you argue with Rabbi Eliezer? Rabbi Yehoshua, representing the sages, stood up and quoted to heaven. Hey, it says in the Torah, Lo b'shamayim hi. The Torah is not in heaven. We don't define and decide the earth's law by heaven's design. We decide earth's law by earthly needs, by earthly consciousness. Essentially, telling heaven to go mind its own business. Now, you got to think about that for a moment. That takes a lot of beitzimus, we would say, a lot of gall, that you're going to go and tell God to mind his own business with regards to how to interpret and practice his own Torah. It's exactly what Rabbi Yehoshua and the sages did. And the story continues that weeks went by, and one of the sages who was there had an encounter with the immortal prophet Eliyahu Navi, and asked Eliyahu, saying, oh gosh, what was God about to do to Rabbi Yehoshua? Rabbi Yehoshua pretty much told God to mind his own business with his own Torah. It was going to be a divine lightning bolt. To which the story says, Elijah says, oh no, God laughed. And he says, Benin itzahuni, my sons have defeated me. Or in other words, they're right. Erich Fromm, the famous psychoanalyst, writes in his book "Shall Be as Gods," which is, a beautiful psychological understanding of Judaism. I highly recommend it. He says this is the basic story, the teachings of our Torah. When we recite every, in our prayers from the Midrash, that freedom, herut is what's written in the Torah itself. Freedom from superstition, from mythology, from fantasy, from dualism. This was the rationalist path that our sages, embracing the Talmud, brought to the world. What they were bringing to the world was order out of chaos. And this was centuries before that saying was adopted by the Masons or others. You see, our sages, again, foresaw the long extended exile. They knew that the violent path of the Essenes and their ilk would lead to their own destruction, which it did. The Essenes fought to the last man. They died. That's why the Talmudic path has never been one of political agitation and violence, but to flow with the natural way of Torah. And what has been the secret of Jewish survival over the centuries that maintained the continuity of Jewish consciousness, that enabled the Torah to survive centuries in exile throughout every culture, every political system, every nation, every place, every time, everything. It wasn't the Zohar, it wasn't the Kabbalah, it was the Talmud. And most people to this day still, they look at the Talmud and they completely misunderstand what it's all about and what was the intent of the sages by putting it together. The Talmud, if you will, is the Torah Tao, the natural way. But you must understand what I mean when I say that. People to this day, they study Talmud every single day. There is a tradition made popular from Europe of studying a folio page, a daf, of Talmud every day called Daf Yomi. This is a practice which I most certainly do not endorse. I certainly do not practice. Matter of fact, even Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was not a fan of that practice. Why? You can't learn a daf a day. Even, it's not just reading it and memorizing it. You see, the redactors of the Talmud, they didn't just put together a collection of material and just, threw it together so you have a record. For anyone who's familiar with the Talmud is an encyclopedia. Is pretty much what it is. It includes within it pretty much everything on almost any topic of discussion. Some people will look at the Talmud and say, look at it, it's got disgusting things in it. Yeah, it does. You're absolutely right. It's got heretical things in it. Yeah, you're right. It does. It has things in it which are offensive or racist or sexist. Yeah, you're right. It does. I'm not going to deny any of that. But none of that is presented as being the religion of Judaism, the way, the will, the word of God. No. It is presented exactly for what it is. The opinions of the authors who stated those words. That is the greatness of what we call Rabbinic Judaism. You see, we have the freedom, the mobility, the fluidity of being able to embrace, entertain all types of ideas and views without necessarily having to accept them all. Now, this is a very, very important point, especially in our highly divided society today, in which if you express an idea, a view, or an opinion that others don't agree with, it leads to all kinds of strife and division. Well, in the Talmudic psyche, we could sit and argue and debate and discuss, even to a point, call names. But at the end of the day, It's kind of like, the bell would ring and everybody would go off and everybody's friends again. There was nothing personal about the debate or the discussion or the argument, because we all recognize what we're doing here. And this is the great secret. What I'm trying to share with you here and reveal to you is that the nature and flow of rabbinic discussion conceals within it the profound truths of the ebb and flow of Sephirotic consciousness. So when I'm talking about a Kabbalistic Talmud, I'm not just talking about, if you will, the stories or the legends of our sages, which was compiled in the 16th century in a book called Ein Yaakov, right? I did over, I think, 50 hours of classes in that. And I'm planning to make that entire series presently available for sale. I'm going to be working to try to make all of those lessons available for free, simply because I want you to have access and exposure to this material. Our school, the KosherTorah school, financially we've struggled for 25 years. And frankly, in the hands of God. Whatever we do is always in God's hands. So in that respect, when it comes to teaching the Torah, I firmly and fully believe that this is in God's hands. This is God's Torah. This is God's way. So we're just going to do what we need to do and provide for that. And I trust and pray that God will provide for us. I also, within not too long ago, taught a class on the Talmud Bavli from Tractate Berachot. I'm also planning to release that publicly as well. We'll put all of these lessons, God be willing, as soon as we're able, on our YouTube channel, KosherTorah YouTube channel. They're all audio, so it's not like you need to see me. You know what I look like. And listen and learn. So my battery is running low. I don't know why. I'm supposed to have this plugged in here, but whatever. Anyway, I hope we don't have problems of connectivity. These things happen. I actually have it plugged in, but I don't know what's going on. But anyway, my point again, when it comes to our understanding of Talmud, you have to understand and recognize that when I'm talking about the mysteries of the Talmud, I'm not talking about the legends and the stories and the references to magical traditions or Babylonian superstitions. No, I'm talking about the ebb and flow of the nature of the written material, of how the logical progressions and discussions, these things reveal to us not only levels and layers and flow of consciousness, but interactions with the angelic realms, which our sages were experts in doing. This we could see recorded in the words of the Mishnah itself, in the ebb and flow of discussion of Talmudic dialectics, in recent centuries in which things were interpreted philosophically. The nature of the ebb and flow of consciousness was lost and therefore was concealed. But for those who know and understand the true essence of Talmud, recognize how the ebb and flow and the movement of consciousness leads one to greater revelations and insights into the reality of the world around us. The sages of the Talmud, following the ebb and flow of the consciousness and the waves of consciousness that Talmudic consciousness brought to one, they recognized that what we today call the rationalist path corresponds to what we call the Sfert Bina. But if anybody's ever studied Talmud, you're in the rationalist intellectual, and all of a sudden you go into the Agadic, the stories and the legends. You're going back and forth and back. This is an old secret of the Kabbalah called Sechel to Nuda, oscillating consciousness. We go from Bina consciousness to Chochmah consciousness back and forth, and you're going into this natural flow of movement. For those of you who understand the martial arts, you will know what I'm talking about now. This is what the sages were teaching as the redemptive power of the human mind. In this time, God brought the exile upon us, so to wean us off of a childlike spirituality, wherein which we always had to receive from an outside source, so that we could evolve and grow to develop our inside source, so that the consciousness and the mind can grow and expand and experience personally the reality of the greater world around us. This is the Kabbalah of the Talmud. And very few of my peers have ever been able to grasp this, experience it, and flow with it. This is the true Tao, if you will, the way of halakha of our Torah path. And this is what makes it so vital and important and successful. This is why the Talmud has been able to keep the nation of Israel identified and together throughout all the centuries. There are those people who elevate the Zohar to this high, lofty level, which it does not deserve. No, the Zohar, I'm not speaking against the Zohar, God forbid. But if you ever want to put weight between the two, most people today don't know how to go with the flow in understanding Zohar. They still look at it externally. But when you understand the Talmud, you understand that